We're joined here now by Leo Hickman. Thank you very much for joining us after quite a tough session.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, first of all, do you think, because we never really heard about it, does tourism do any good?
Of course it does. There's the whole point of my book, really, and coming here to this event today was to talk about some of the major problems and negativities within the industry, but also to promote the message, really, that tourism does do a lot of good, but it needs to do an awful lot better and needs to learn some of the key lessons from some of the all too rare projects and companies that are doing some good around the world, and to drag this kind of tanker of an industry around and get it redirected, because on its current course it's really going towards some big problems as I see it and as I researched for the book.
Because one of the things you did talk about and likened tourism to a resource, a destination that will be used up if we're not careful. I mean, how do you see the best ways of making it sustainable?
Well, personally, I think it's a gear shift in the mental approach to what the destination is. We need to think of it and view it as you would, as any other company would view their assets. They need to see them on their, maybe balance sheet's not the right word, but they need to see that they're essentially, their key assets are the people and the natural beauty or the unique culture within that destination. And if they lose sight of that and it becomes just about infrastructure and the number of hotel rooms and the quality of the road from the airport to the hotel, then, which you do hear all too often in the industry, then you lose touch of the fact of what has actually got people to travel great distances to come and enjoy 1-2 weeks or whatever it is in that industry. And there needs to be a mental gear shift in terms of thinking about what your key asset is. You're essentially selling the right or opportunity to come into someone else's home, and therefore you need to have that respect you would show and that understanding and that careful touch of foot that you would have if you were going into someone else's home. And I think that's a message for tourists themselves, but also for the industry, to think and move away from that idea that this is all about the present tense. As I just was talking about in the talk earlier, was this, everywhere I saw across the industry, I saw a very blinkered, short-term thinking mentality within the industry. No one's thinking about horizons or thinking about the next generation of tourists. They're thinking about exploiting the assets today, right now, and very rarely think beyond the 10-year horizon is the experience I found all the way around the world where I went to investigate the book.
But you touched on it just there. Surely this requires a shift in the mindset of the consumer. If you've gone to Prague on a stag, you're going there because the beer's cheap, not because you want to see some lovely architecture.
Exactly, but the industry is equally culpable of doing that because of the way it markets and it generates trade. Yes, the book, hopefully, and whatever I write about, is a stark reality check for the tourists themselves, but I see this as being three stakeholders: the tourists, the middlemen, the industry, the tour operators, the industry that creates the dreams, makes the dreams come true, as they would say, and then the destinations on the ground, both in terms of the local and national governments and regulation and things that those destinations need to have. And all three parties, as I explore in the book, need to really do their own bit to make sure that tourism is a much more positive force around the world than it currently is.
Now, speaking just earlier, you did mention a lottery system whereby you could have a global audience vying to go to some of the best places in the world to see the sites like the Acropolis. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's an idea that has to address it's not so much a problem, but the reality of the fact that everyone is predicting just runaway growth in tourist arrivals as Indian tourists, Chinese tourists, Brazilian tourists join the amount of tourists from the so-called Western world and travel over the next couple of decades. And we're already seeing some very precious, world-famous tourism destinations, such as Machu Picchu, Venice, the Great Barrier Reef, the Acropolis, the pyramids, wherever it may be, under enormous pressure already. And if we don't want to see those incredible, wonderful places degraded for the next generation of tourists, we've got to think about capping visitors. That cap, as a straight cap, is a very unsophisticated way of doing it. You've seen in Bhutan, where they lay down, I don't know what it is, $200 a day fee, that all it means is basically the rich are the people, the global elite, the rich are the people that can only ever travel in the future. A more equitable, fairer way of doing it, in my eyes, would be to have an annual, let's say, an annual global internet-based lottery where anyone who wants to go to, say, Venice applies a year before for a golden ticket, the kind of lucky entrance ticket. And the destination themselves, crucially, this isn't the industry laying it down from remotely, the destination, the various people within that destination have to decide what is a sustainable cap. Let's say, for sake of argument, in a place like Venice, it's 1 million people a year. Otherwise, it just gets too much and the whole experience gets degraded. Then this lottery-based system would allow for that 1 million people to enter, but it would also change the mentality of the tourists themselves away from being a consumer who's saved up all year to spend a lot of money and they want to consume, and therefore it's all on their terms that they want that transaction to operate. Changing that to a sense of privilege, that I was lucky enough to win a ticket to in the internet lottery to Venice or the Barrier Reef or Machu Picchu, and therefore immediately your sense of engagement with that destination changes. Now I know it's a controversial idea, but I would love to see it explored, and I'm pretty convinced as the years go on, many destinations will probably, maybe not exactly like that, but will come to that kind of idea where they have to realise that these assets will be destroyed within a generation, or not destroyed but degraded beyond the point where they're marketable, and this is what it's all about. Whether the message gets back to the tourists reading their brochure, and the word of mouth, friend of a friend, family says, I went there last year, it's been ruined. We've all heard that a million times before, and we can learn the lessons from places like Benidorm is a classic example I visited for the book, which has really fought and struggled over the last 10, 15 years to desperately stop the hemorrhaging of visitors from what it would call its traditional markets, like the English or the Germans, who've effectively written it off in many people's eyes as a destination because they see it as degraded. And now they're hunting around for new markets in Russia or Eastern Europe in a desperate race for survival, in a way.
And do you think that the third-party organisations, such as fair trade organisations, NCOs, governmental things, do they have a role to play? Can they help this at all?
I think they can. I think fair trade is a good example of a globally renowned certification brand that could work very well in tourism, I think. Tourism to date, the certification attempts in ecotourism, to my mind, have woefully failed. There hasn't been any standardization. There's hundreds of them all around the world. It's very hard as a consumer to understand what you're getting. And certification is all about being trusting that label. And fair trade already has tremendous currency of trust with people all around the world. And for me, it would make great sense to have carefully, it has to be done carefully, inevitably, that we start seeing fair trade hotels, not where they're serving fair trade coffee and have fair trade linen on the beds. That's not really my point. It's more about the actual staff of the hotel and the suppliers to the hotels, knowing that all of the people that make that dream experience have all had some trickle-down benefit from the amount of money we've spent at that hotel. And I think that could be a very powerful force for good as we move forward with the industry.
And just finally, a lot of the words you've been using in describing the time we have to do these things are generational. You've spoken of decades, very long periods. The Chinese and the Indian explosions, we know, are not going to wait generations or decades. Do we have time to save our tourism industry?
Well, I think there's a danger of saying tourism as this big kind of blob term. But what I saw in Thailand, for example, was when I interviewed people there saying they are very concerned. They're welcoming of these big groups of Chinese coming in, just as they were welcoming of the Japanese and the Brits coming in the 70s and 80s in large volume, in mass organised tours. But they fear that that transition is so fast and this new market is arriving so fast that there isn't time to sort of catch up and think about planning and regulation issues to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes all over again and at greater speed in a way, because the volume is much larger. But so no, time is pressing, but then different destinations have different time scales. So the destinations in Eastern Asia, which will see most traffic from India and China, they're going to have to, you know, get on with this like kind of yesterday, compared to other destinations which have a little bit more time. But I don't think there's any room for complacency. Everywhere I went around the world, I saw destinations under pressure, and natural resources and people both being exploited and degraded through tourism. And I think the industry really needs to urgently wake up and sort of smell the hopefully fair trade coffee about some of these, you know, key issues.